Open it. $100 million. If you can. Richard Cole didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The room bent toward him anyway, a quiet gravity built from tailored suits, polished glass, and the kind of wealth that made people laugh before they even understood the joke. And they did laugh, soft at first, then louder, echoing off the steel walls of the private conference suite on the 42nd floor, where the safe stood embedded like a monument, brushed metal catching the cold white light, numbers glowing faintly on the keypad as if waiting to be challenged, but not by her, never by her, because Ava Brooks stood near the wall with a cleaning cloth in her hand, uniform a shade too faded to belong among million-dollar decisions, sneakers worn thin at the edges, her reflection barely visible in the mirrored panel beside the safe, easy to ignore, easier to dismiss. And someone did, a man in a navy suit stepping back without looking, pressing a glass into her hand like she was part of the furniture. Careful with that, he muttered, already turning away, because to them she was movement without meaning, presence without weight, just another pair of hands wiping down surfaces no one else noticed. But Ava didn't move right away, didn't reach for the smudge on the glass, didn't lower her eyes the way they expected. Instead, she looked at the safe, not quickly, not curiously, but steadily, like she was reading something written beneath the surface. And that pause stretched just long enough to bend the rhythm of the room. Just enough for one of the executives to glance over, puzzled, before dismissing it with a shrug, while Richard, still amused, tapped the keypad with the back of his finger. State of the art, he said, almost casually. Biometric delay, rotating code, randomized input tolerance. He smiled, the kind of smile that assumed agreement. Even my senior engineers couldn't crack it on the first try. More laughter, sharper this time, directed outward, upward, never downward, never toward the girl standing 10 feet away, but Ava was still looking, eyes moving across the numbers, the faint discoloration on certain keys, the subtle difference in sheen wear. Fingertips had pressed more often than others, patterns hidden in plain sight, the kind you only noticed if you had spent years watching, fixing, figuring things out without being asked, without being taught, because no one thought to teach you. And she shifted her weight slightly, the cloth in her hand lowering by an inch, her gaze tightening, and then she spoke, not loud, not challenging, just clear enough to cut through the tail end of a laugh. It's not random, and the words landed oddly. In the air, not heavy, not dramatic, just out of place, like a note played in the wrong key. And for a second no one responded, not because they were listening, but because they weren't sure they had heard correctly, until one man turned, eyebrows lifting. What? He asked, half amused, half annoyed, and Ava didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone, her focus still on the safe. The code, she said. It repeats behavior. And that got a reaction, not belief, not yet, but attention, a subtle shift, a pause in the casual movement of hands and voices, while Richard tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering behind the confidence. You're saying you can read it? He asked, tone still light, still dismissive, but thinner now, stretched over something sharper, and Ava finally stepped forward, one step, quiet against the polished floor, not asking, not waiting, just moving, and that alone changed the room, because movement implied intent, and intent from her wasn't something they had accounted for. A few glances exchanged, a small, almost imperceptible tightening of posture among the executives, as if the rules had shifted without warning, and she stopped just short of the safe, close enough for the keypad light to reflect in her eyes, her fingers hovering for a moment, not touching, just observing, the faint wear on the numbers, the sequence hidden in habit, and somewhere behind her someone whispered, "This is ridiculous," but softer now, less certain, because even doubt needed confidence to sound convincing, and confidence had slipped just a fraction, enough to be felt, and Richard gestured once, a small motion, permission or challenge, it wasn't clear which. Go ahead, he said, and the room stilled, not completely, not dramatically, but enough that the hum of the air system became noticeable, enough that every breath seemed slightly louder than before, and Ava placed her finger on the first key, pressing gently, a soft beep breaking the silence. Then she paused, just long enough to make the next move matter, and in that pause something shifted, something no one in the room could quite name yet, but they all felt it. The sense that this wasn't a joke anymore, not to her, and maybe, just maybe, not to them either. The second beep did not come right away, and that delay made people shift in their seats because confidence usually moves fast, but this did not feel fast, it felt careful, and that made it uncomfortable. Ava's finger hovered just above the keypad again, then moved slightly to the right, choosing a different number than anyone expected, and when she pressed it the tones sounded identical, yet somehow heavier, as if the room had started assigning meaning to something that had always been simple. Richard folded his arms slowly, not defensive, not relaxed, just watching now, his smile reduced to a thin line, while one of the engineers leaned forward, squinting at the panel. "She is guessing," he said under his breath, but he did not sound convinced because Ava's hand did not move like someone guessing. It paused, it adjusted, it observed the surface each time before making contact, as if the code was already there, and she was just tracing it out of hiding. Another beep, then another, the rhythm uneven, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, and the air seemed to tighten around each sound, until even the quiet hum of the building faded into the background. Ava shifted her stance slightly, her shoulder brushing the cold steel of the safe, and for a brief second her reflection aligned perfectly with the keypad, a ghosted overlay of her eyes and the numbers, and she noticed something small, a difference in where that most people would never see, a faint dullness on certain keys, not in sequence, but in pattern. She exhaled softly, not relief, not doubt, just confirmation, and changed direction again, pressing a number that had not been touched yet during her attempt. A man near the table let out a short breath. "That is wrong," he said quickly, almost too quickly, as if trying to reclaim control of the moment, but the system did not reject her input. There was no error tone, no flashing red, just silence followed by the steady glow of the panel waiting for more. And that silence spread heavier than any mistake would have. Richard stepped closer, now not interrupting, not approving, just closing the distance until he stood a few feet behind her, his presence filling the space like pressure rather than authority. "You have seen something," he said quietly, and it was not a question. Ava did not turn, she did not explain, she simply continued. "One more number," then a pause longer than before, her hand hovering, as if the final choice mattered differently than the rest. Because it did, it always did. The last number was never just part of the code, it was the point where assumption became outcome, and for the first time her fingers stilled completely. The room leaned into that stillness. People who had spent years making decisions, now waiting on someone they had ignored minutes ago, the irony invisible to them, but present in the way their voices had disappeared. Ava's eyes moved once more across the keypad, tracing the subtle arc of repeated contact, the unconscious habits of a man who believed in randomness, but lived in patterns. She adjusted her hand slightly, not toward the most worn key, but toward the one that completed the shape, and when she pressed it, the sound that followed was softer than the others, almost swallowed by the room itself. Then nothing, no immediate response, no movement, just a quiet system thinking, and in that suspended second someone shifted, someone else inhaled sharply, and Richard's gaze fixed on the seam of the safe door, not blinking, not smiling, waiting for the truth to decide what he believed about her and about himself. And then a faint internal click echoed from within the lock mechanism, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, final, and undeniable. The sound did not echo, but it spread through the room anyway, a quiet mechanical truth that no one could interrupt and no one could deny. And for a moment nobody moved, because movement would mean accepting what had just happened, and accepting it meant rewriting everything they thought they understood about the girl standing in front of that safe. Ava did not react. She did not turn. She did not reach for the handle. Her hand simply lowered slowly to her side, as if the task had already ended long before the lock gave in, and behind her a chair creaked, someone shifting forward, finally unable to hold the silence. "That is not possible," one of the engineers said, but the words felt thinner than before, like they had lost their weight somewhere between doubt and realization. Richard did not speak. He stepped closer again until he stood directly beside the safe, his reflection now visible in the brushed steel, his expression no longer shaped by amusement, but by something quieter, something that did not belong to the version of himself he usually presented. He looked at the keypad, then at Ava, then back at the seam of the door, as if confirming that it was still there, still real, still under his control. And yet it did not feel that way anymore, because control had just shifted without permission, without warning. Ava glanced once at the panel, not proud, not nervous, just certain Then she took a small step back, giving space, not asking for recognition, not expecting anything at all, and that absence of expectation unsettled them more than the act itself. Because people understood ambition, they understood ego, they understood the need to prove something, but this was different. This was someone who had done something impossible and did not seem to care about being seen doing it. Richard reached for the handle slowly, his fingers pausing just before contact, as if even he needed a second to decide whether he was ready to confirm what the sound had already told him. The room leaned in again, every eye tracking that small movement, every breath held just a fraction longer than normal, and when his hand finally closed around the cold metal, he did not pull right away. He looked at Ava once more, searching for something, maybe a clue, maybe a challenge, maybe even a mistake, but she gave him nothing, no smile, no signal, just stillness. Then he pulled the door open, and the hinges moved smoothly, quietly revealing the interior exactly as it had always been, stacks of bundled cash arranged with precision, untouched, unchanged, except for one thing. Now it was open, and the fact that it was open mattered more than what was inside. A low murmur spread through the room, not loud, not chaotic, just enough to break the silence into fragments of disbelief and recalculation. How did she do that? Someone whispered, but no one answered because the answer was standing right there, and they did not know how to ask for it. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost under the hum of the building, and for the first time since she had spoken, he addressed her directly, not as background, not as interruption, but as presence. Explain it. He said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier ease. Ava turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze, not confrontational, not submissive, just level. You use patterns, she said simply. Everyone does, even when they think they do not. The words hung there, not dramatic, not loud, but heavier than anything else that had been said in that room, because they did not just explain the safe, they explained him, and for a second that realization showed in his eyes before he masked it again, not fully, not perfectly, but enough for everyone else to miss it except her. She looked away, first not out of fear, but because there was nothing more to prove. She picked up the cleaning cloth from where she had set it down earlier and stepped back toward the glass wall, her movements returning to the quiet rhythm they had before, as if the moment had already passed for her, even though it had just begun for everyone else. And behind her the safe remained open, the money untouched, and Richard Cole stood in front of it, not like a man who owned it, but like a man who had just discovered something inside it. He could not measure, no one told her to stop cleaning, and that was the strangest part, because a few minutes ago every movement she made had been invisible, and now every movement was being watched, yet no one gave her instructions, no one corrected her, no one dismissed her. They just stood there, caught between what they had seen and what they did not know how to do with it. Ava wiped the glass slowly, the same steady rhythm as before, but now the reflection had changed. Behind her the safe remained open, and Richard Cole had not stepped away from it. He was still standing there, looking not at the money, but at the space around it, as if something else had been revealed that he could not quite name. One of the executives cleared his throat, attempting to restore order. We should secure that, he said, gesturing toward the open door, but he did not move forward, and no one else did either. Because the authority in the room had shifted in a way that was subtle but undeniable. Richard finally closed the safe, the door sealing with a soft mechanical sound that felt quieter than before, as if the system itself understood that something had changed. He did not lock it again, not yet. Instead, he turned back toward Ava, watching her as she reached a smudge near the edge of the window, stretching slightly on her toes to reach it. A simple motion. Ordinary, almost forgettable, except now it was not forgettable at all, because it was the same person who had just read through his security like it was handwriting. Where did you learn that? He asked, his voice no longer casual, no longer performative. It carried weight now, not dominance, but intent. Ava lowered her hand slowly and looked at the glass for a moment longer before answering. I watch things, she said, and the simplicity of it made someone in the room shift uncomfortably, because it did not sound like an answer, it sounded like a mirror. Richard stepped closer, closing the distance between them, not aggressively, not urgently, just enough to stand within the same frame of reflection. That system was designed to prevent pattern recognition, he said, and there was something in his tone now, something that bordered on disbelief. Ava nodded slightly. It prevents careless patterns, she replied, not personal ones. The words settled differently this time, heavier, more precise, and for a second no one spoke, because they were all thinking about their own habits, their own unnoticed repetitions, the way their hands moved, Without thought, the way they assumed complexity meant safety. Richard let out a quiet breath and looked back at the safe, then at the keypad, as if seeing it for the first time without the layer of confidence that had always been there before. You saw through it in minutes, he said. Ava shook her head. Just once, not minutes, she said. It has been there longer than that. And that sentence lingered because it implied something none of them wanted to admit, that the flaw had always existed, that it had been visible all along, just not to them. One of the engineers finally stepped forward, now unable to hold back any longer, examining the keypad closely, his fingers hovering but not touching, as if the surface had changed. She is right, he murmured almost to himself. There is a repetition bias here. Another voice followed, then another, the room slowly filling with analysis where there had been certainty before. But Ava had already stepped away again, returning to the far side of the room, picking up a second cloth from her cart, adjusting the bottle beside it, as if preparing for the next task, like nothing had happened, like the moment had already passed through her and moved on. Richard watched that more than anything else, the lack of reaction, the absence of pride, the way she did not claim the room, even though she had just shifted it completely. What is your name? He asked, and this time it was not rhetorical, not dismissive, it was direct. Ava paused for a fraction of a second, then answered without turning around. Ava Brooks. And even the way she said it was steady, grounded, not trying to impress, not trying to disappear. Just stating what was true, and for a moment that felt like the most significant thing in the room, not the safe, not the money, not the system, but the fact that he had not known her name until now, and somehow that realization stayed with him longer than the sound of the lock opening ever would. The room did not return to normal after that, and everyone could feel it, even if no one said it out loud. The conversation that had once filled the space with easy confidence was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more careful, as if every word now had to pass through a different filter before being spoken. Ava moved along the glass, while her motions steady, controlled, the faint scent of cleaning solution mixing with the cool recycled air, and for the first time the sound of her cloth against the surface was noticeable, not because it was loud, but because everything else had softened around it. Richard remained where he stood for a few seconds longer than necessary, his attention still fixed on her, not in curiosity anymore, but an evaluation, not the kind he used in boardrooms, but something slower, something less certain. He took a step away from the safe, then another, until he was no longer centered in the room, and that alone shifted the balance again, because people had built their positions around him, and now he had moved. One of the executives tried to recover the rhythm. We should review the system logs immediately and run a full diagnostic, he said more firmly this time, as if structure could restore control. But his voice did not carry the same authority it had earlier. It sounded like a reaction, not a directive. Richard did not respond to him. Instead, he walked toward Ava, stopping a few feet behind her, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to be part of her space. You said you watch things, he said, and this time it was not a challenge, it was an attempt to understand. Ava finished the section of glass she was working on, then folded the cloth once precisely before answering. People repeat what feels comfortable, she said, even when they try not to. She turned slightly, now not fully facing him, but enough that her words were not lost in reflection. Security systems are built by people, so they carry the same habits. Richard nodded slowly, as if each word was aligning with something he had overlooked for years. And you see that just by looking? He asked. Ava shrugged lightly. By noticing, she said, and the distinction mattered more than it sounded like it did, because noticing implied patience, attention, time, the kind of time that was invisible to people who never had to wait for anything. Richard glanced back at the safe again, then at the engineers, who were now quietly discussing among themselves, their voices lower than before, less certain. One of them looked up, as if expecting instruction, but Richard did not give any. Instead, he stayed where he was, his focus returning to Ava. You are not trained in this, he said, not dismissive, just stating what he assumed. Ava shook her head once. No, she replied, but I fix things when they break, and most things break the same way. That sentence landed differently than the others because it carried experience without credentials, something that could not be easily categorized. In the room around them, a phone buzzed softly on the table. Someone silenced it immediately, the interruption feeling out of place in a moment that had become unexpectedly still. Richard looked at Ava again, more directly this time. What else would you change? He asked, and the question shifted everything, because it was no longer about what she had done, it was about what she could do. Ava paused for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was deciding whether to give it. She glanced at the keypad once more, then back at the glass. I would not rely on one layer, she said. If someone can read behavior, then the system needs to adapt faster than the person can. Richard's expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show that he was listening differently, now not as someone evaluating a risk, but as someone recognizing value. And that realization did not go unnoticed by the others in the room. The same executive who had spoken earlier shifted his stance, watching the exchange more carefully, now recalculating silently. Where he stood within it, Ava returned to her work again, wiping the final section of the glass, her movements calm, unhurried, as if the moment had already passed for her. But for everyone else it had just begun to unfold, because the question was no longer how she opened the safe, it was why someone like her had been standing in the corner unnoticed for so long. And what that said about everything else. They believed they controlled the room, should have moved on by now, but it did not, and that delay stretched into something heavier than silence, because it forced everyone to sit inside what had just happened without the comfort of explanation. Ava placed the spray bottle back onto her cart, aligning it carefully with the edge, as if precision mattered even in small things, and that detail did not go unnoticed anymore, not after what they had seen. Richard watched her hands for a moment longer than necessary, the way she adjusted the cloth, the way she did not rush, the way everything she touched seemed intentional. You said most things break the same way, he said, and this time his voice carried something different, not authority, not curiosity, but reflection. Ava nodded once, still facing the glass. People trust what feels familiar, she replied. That is usually where it starts. Behind them, one of the engineers spoke up more cautiously now. We designed that system with multiple safeguards, redundancy checks, randomized sequences. It should not behave that way. His tone was technical, but there was a quiet edge beneath it, something close to defensiveness. Ava turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, without fully entering the conversation. It does not behave that way all the time, she said. Only when the person using it does. The engineer frowned, not dismissing her, but not fully accepting it either, because accepting it would mean accepting that the flaw was not in the code alone. Richard took a slow breath, then walked back toward the safe, his steps measured, not rushed. He ran his fingers lightly across the keypad, without pressing anything this time, as if feeling the surface rather than using it. We built this to eliminate human error, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Ava's voice came quietly from behind him. You cannot eliminate it, she said. You can only hide it until someone looks closely enough. That sentence did not challenge him. It settled into the space like something that had always been true, but never spoken, and for a moment he did not respond, because he was not used to being answered that way, not without hesitation, not without deference. One of the executives shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. So we can recalibrate the system, run additional tests, ensure compliance across all access points, he offered, trying to pull the moment back into something structured, something controlled. Richard glanced at him briefly, then back at the keypad. We will, he said, but his tone suggested that was not the point anymore. Ava moved her cart slightly, adjusting its position near the wall, the wheels rolling softly against the polished floor, the sound subtle but grounding in a room that had lost its usual rhythm. She picked up another cloth, folded it once, then twice, her movements steady, predictable, in contrast to everything else that had become uncertain. Richard turned fully, now facing her again. What would you look at next? He asked, and the question carried more weight than the previous ones because it implied continuation, not just analysis. Ava paused for a moment, considering, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood what the question meant. Now she glanced around the room, briefly taking in the layout, the doors, the placement of devices, the positions people naturally occupied, entry points. She said, not just physical ones, the ways people move, the paths they take without thinking. She looked toward the hallway leading out of the conference suite. You can tell a lot by what people ignore. The executive who had spoken earlier followed her gaze, then looked back, uncertain, as if seeing the room differently for the first time. Richard nodded, slowly absorbing the shift, not just in the system, but in perspective. You are saying the problem is not just the safe, he said. Ava met his eyes for a brief moment. It never is, she replied. And that answer did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like an opening, something larger than the room, something that extended beyond the walls. And for a second no one spoke, because they all sensed it, the realization that what had just happened was not an isolated moment, but a pattern itself, one they had not noticed until now, and in that quiet, Ava returned to her work again, as if the conversation had already moved past her even though it had only just begun for everyone else. The room did not feel like a conference space anymore. It felt like something unfinished, like a question that had been asked but not fully understood, and that uncertainty lingered in the way people stood, in the way they hesitated before speaking, in the way their eyes kept drifting back to Ava even when they tried to focus elsewhere. She moved her cart a few inches to the left, aligning it with the edge of the wall again, the small click of the wheels settling into place, sounding louder than it should have, because everything else had grown quiet around it. Richard remained near the safe, but he was no longer looking at it. He was looking at the room itself, following her earlier words, tracing the paths people had taken without thinking, the places they naturally stood, the subtle routines that had once felt invisible now standing out with uncomfortable clarity. One of the engineers crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, shifting his stance, as if suddenly aware of his own patterns. "We can implement adaptive code rotation based on user behavior," he said, trying to regain footing in something technical, something measurable. "Machine learning can adjust the sequence dynamically." His voice carried more confidence now, but it sounded like a response to her, not in original direction. Ava did not turn, but she heard him. She always heard more than people expected. "That helps," she said calmly, "until the system learns the same habits you do." The engineer frowned again, not dismissing her, but not satisfied either, because her answer did not give him a clear solution. It gave him a boundary. Richard walked slowly toward the center of the room, now his gaze moving across the table, the chairs, the placement of devices, the subtle marks left by repeated use. A glass always set in the same spot, a chair slightly angled more than the others, a screen touched more frequently on one side than the other, patterns everywhere, once ignored, now impossible to unsee. "We built layers to protect against intrusion," he said quietly, almost to himself. Ava's voice followed without urgency. "Layers only work if they change faster than the person trying to understand them." He stopped at that, not because he disagreed, but because the simplicity of it left no room to hide behind complexity. One of the executives stepped forward, now his tone measured, careful. "Are you suggesting we redesign the entire access structure?" he asked, not confrontational, but cautious. Ava paused for a moment, then turned slightly enough for her reflection to align with his. "I am suggesting you look at what you assume is safe," she said, and asked why. The question settled deeper than any instruction, because it did not point to a system, it pointed to a mindset, and that was harder to adjust. The executive nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but no longer dismissive either. Richard exhaled once more, then looked at Ava again. "You are not on our team," he said, and it was not a statement of status, it was an acknowledgement of distance. Ava shook her head lightly. "No," she answered simply, and there was no resentment in it, no expectation, just truth. "And yet you saw what we missed," he continued, and this time there was no edge in his voice, no defensiveness, just recognition. Ava did not respond right away. She looked back at the glass, finishing the last section, her hand moving in slow, deliberate circles before lowering the cloth again. "You were not looking for it," she said, and that answer carried more weight than anything else, because it explained everything without accusing anyone in the room. Richard held that for a second, then nodded almost imperceptibly, as if accepting something he had not planned to confront today. The engineer glanced at him, waiting for direction. The executive shifted again, preparing to speak, but Richard raised a hand slightly, not to silence them, but to pause the moment, because something about it mattered more than the next decision. Ava reached for her cart, adjusting the handle, preparing to move on to the next room, as if her part in this had ended, but as she turned slightly, her eyes passed over the keypad one more time, and for a brief second, she noticed something else, something even smaller than before, a detail buried beneath the pattern, and she stopped, not fully, just enough to register it. And that pause was almost invisible to everyone else, but Richard saw it, because now he was watching differently. Now he was noticing too. "What is it?" he asked quietly, and the question came without hesitation this time, without doubt. Ava did not answer immediately. She looked at the safe, then at the door, then back at the keypad, her expression unchanged, but her focus sharper. "It is not just the code," she said finally. "There is something else you are trusting that you should not," and that sentence did not close the moment, it opened it wider, because now the problem was no longer contained to what they had just seen. It extended beyond it into something deeper, something they had not even considered. And for the first time since the safe had opened, the room felt uncertain again, not because of what had happened, but because of what might still be hidden. The sentence did not land like a warning, it landed like a shift, and the room felt it immediately because uncertainty had returned, but deeper this time, not about what they had seen, but about what they had not. Ava did not move right away, her gaze still resting on the keypad, then drifting toward the small panel beside it, the one most people ignored, because it did not look important, just a narrow strip of glass, with a faint sensor line built into the frame. Richard followed her eyes instinctively, now not out of habit, but because he had learned something in the last few minutes. Watching mattered more than assuming. What are we trusting? He asked quietly, and the question carried no resistance, only focus. Ava stepped closer again, not with urgency, but with clarity, her hand hovering near the edge of the panel, not touching, just tracing the outline in the air. Access confirmation, she said. Not the code, the system that says the right person is standing here. One of the engineers stepped forward quickly, now recognizing the component. Biometric validation, thermal mapping, pressure calibration, it cross-checks identity before the code even processes. His voice returned to technical ground, but it did not sound as steady as before. Ava nodded slightly. It checks what it expects to see, she replied, not what is actually there. The engineer hesitated just a fraction of a second, and that hesitation was enough for everyone to notice, because it meant there was something to consider. Richard moved closer to the panel, now his reflection overlapping with the faint sensor line. He placed his hand near it without activating anything, just observing the surface. You think it can be fooled, he said. Ava shook her head gently. Everything can be fooled if it is designed to recognize patterns instead of questioning them. That answer settled into the room heavier than before, because now the problem was no longer hidden in complexity, it was exposed in assumption. One of the executives glanced toward the door instinctively, as if the boundary of the room suddenly felt less certain. We have controlled access on every floor, he said more quietly now. Security checkpoints, restricted credentials, monitored entry logs. Ava turned her head slightly toward him. And they all follow routines, she said. Same people, same time, same path. She gestured lightly toward the hallway without looking directly. If someone understands that they do not need to break in, they just need to fit in. The words created a different kind of silence, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of realization, because fitting in was easier than breaking through, and everyone in the room knew it, even if they had never said it out loud. Richard lowered his hand slowly from the panel, his posture shifting not visibly, but enough that the weight of his presence changed again. We built this to keep the wrong people out, he said, and there was something in his voice now, something closer to reflection than certainty. Ava met his gaze briefly. Sometimes it lets the wrong assumptions in instead, she replied, and that line stayed with him longer than anything else because it did not accuse the system, it pointed at the thinking behind it. One of the engineers stepped back, running a hand through his hair, quietly recalculating the architecture in his head while another opened a tablet, but did not start typing, as if unsure where to begin. The executive who had spoken earlier remained still now, his earlier confidence replaced by something more measured, more cautious. Richard looked at Ava again, not as an outsider, not as a disruption, but as a reference point. Show me, he said simply, and that request changed the dynamic completely, because it was no longer about explaining, it was about proving it. Ava did not hesitate this time. She stepped forward fully, aligning herself with the panel, her hand moving closer, not touching yet, just hovering at the edge where the sensor would normally engage. You are trusting that this only responds to what it recognizes, she said quietly, but recognition can be predicted. She shifted her stance slightly, adjusting the angle of her hand, not pressing, not forcing, just positioning, as if she understood not only the system, but the expectation behind it. And the room leaned in again, not with the same disbelief as before, but with something sharper, something more focused, because now they were not watching a surprise, they were watching a possibility unfold, and none of them knew yet how far it would go. No one interrupted her this time, and that alone said more than anything else had so far, because minutes ago they would have stopped her before she even reached the panel. Now they were waiting, watching, learning. Without admitting it, Ava held her hand just inches from the sensor, her fingers relaxed, not stiff, not posed, just natural, as if she understood that the system was not only reading position, but expectation. The faint line of the scanner flickered almost imperceptibly, reacting to proximity, not touch, and that subtle response made one of the engineers lean forward sharply. It is active, he said quietly, almost surprised, as if the system had responded to something it should not have. Ava did not look at him. Her focus remained on the panel, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. "It is always active," she said. "You just do not notice it until you are looking for it." Richard stood just behind her, now not close enough to interfere, but close enough to see every detail, the slight shift of her wrist, the angle of her fingers, the way she adjusted without thinking, like someone aligning with something invisible. "What are you doing?" he asked, and the question carried no doubt, now only attention. Ava moved her hand a fraction higher, then slightly to the left, not touching, still not activating anything deliberately, but the sensor line brightened again, responding to the change, as if it recognized something familiar, something expected. "It is reading range," she said quietly. "Temperature, shape, distance. It is not looking for identity, it is looking for a match." One of the engineers shook his head instinctively. "It is calibrated to specific profiles. There are thresholds. It cannot just accept anything." Ava nodded slightly. "It does not accept anything," she replied. "It accepts what looks close enough over time." That distinction landed harder because it suggested not a flaw, but a drift, something gradual, something unnoticed. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. "You are saying the system learns tolerance," he said. Ava adjusted her hand again, just enough to trigger a soft internal response from the panel, a faint hum almost lost beneath the air system, but present now, undeniable. "Every system does," she said, "especially when it is designed to reduce friction for the user." The executive near the table shifted uncomfortably, hearing his own priorities reflected back in her words. Convenience, efficiency, speed, all the things they had optimized for, now sounding like vulnerabilities instead of advantages. Ava held her position for a second longer, then slowly brought her hand closer, not touching the panel, but entering the range where recognition would normally finalize. The sensor line pulsed once, then steadied, and the engineer who had spoken earlier leaned in further, his voice lower now. "It should not proceed without full verification." But the system did not reject her presence. It hesitated, not an error, not a failure, just a pause, as if deciding, and that hesitation was enough to change everything, because it meant the system was not certain, and uncertainty was not something they had accounted for. Ava withdrew her hand, slightly breaking the response before it could complete, and the panel dimmed again, returning to its neutral state like nothing had happened. But everyone in the room knew something had happened because they had seen it, the possibility not of access, but of ambiguity. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, but heavier than before. "You did not touch it," he said. Ava shook her head. "I did not need to," she replied, and that answer settled deeper than the demonstration itself, because it showed that the system could be influenced without direct interaction. One of the engineers stepped back, now his earlier confidence gone, replaced by calculation. "If the tolerance window expands under repeated use, then someone could align with it over time without triggering it." "Alert," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Ava glanced at him, briefly acknowledging the thought. "Not someone random," she said, "someone who understands the pattern." And that brought the focus back, not to the system, but to the person again. Richard looked at the panel, then at Ava, then at the room around him, seeing it differently, now not as a controlled environment, but as a collection of habits layered over technology. And for a moment, he said nothing, because the realization was still settling. The safe had not been the problem, the code had not been the problem was the belief that patterns could be controlled without being understood, and that belief had just been quietly undone in front of him by someone they had not even noticed when she first walked in the room. Did not rush to speak after that demonstration, and the silence this time felt earned, not forced, because everyone understood that something fundamental had just shifted, not in the system alone, but in the way they had been thinking about it. Richard remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the panel, as if it might reveal something else if he looked hard enough. But it did not. It simply returned to its neutral state, calm, unbothered, unchanged on the surface, and that contrast unsettled him more than anything else, because the flaw was no longer visible, yet it could not be unseen. Ava stepped back from the panel, slowly, her movement deliberate, not dramatic, just enough to signal that she was done showing what needed to be shown. She reached for her card again, adjusting the handle slightly, her fingers steady the same way they had been from the beginning, as if none of this had disrupted her rhythm at all. "How long has that tolerance been there?" Richard asked, and his voice carried something different now, not authority, not curiosity, but responsibility. Ava glanced at the panel once more, then back toward the glass wall. As long as the system has been used the same way, she said it builds around what it expects. One of the engineers shifted quickly, pulling up data on his tablet, now his earlier hesitation replaced by urgency. If the adaptive threshold expands under repeated recognition cycles, then the system could be reinforcing its own assumptions over time. He said, his voice faster, now more focused. It is not just a gap, it is a feedback loop. Ava nodded slightly, not impressed, not dismissive, just acknowledging the direction of his thinking. It learns comfort, she said, and comfort makes it slower to question. The executive near the table ran a hand across his chin, his expression tighter than before. That means access is not just controlled by design, it is influenced by behavior. He said more quietly now, and no one corrected him because they all knew it was true. Richard turned away from the panel, finally, looking out across the room, the same room he had walked into earlier with certainty, now appearing different, not because it had changed, but because he had. We trusted the system to remove bias, he said, and there was no defensiveness left in his tone, only recognition. Ava met his words calmly. Systems reflect the people who build them, she replied. They do not replace them. The weight of that settled deeper than anything else because it extended beyond the safe, beyond the panel, beyond the room itself. One of the engineers stepped closer to the safe again, this time not with confidence, but with caution, his hand hovering near the keypad, as if unsure whether to trust it anymore. We will need to rebuild the validation model from the ground up, he said quietly, and this time no one argued, not because they agreed fully, but because they no longer felt certain enough to disagree. Richard took a slow breath, then looked back at Ava, his expression steady, but changed in a way that could not be easily defined. You saw all of this without access, without training, without any of the data we rely on, he said. Ava shook her head gently. I saw what was already there, she answered. You just were not looking for it. That answer stayed with him, not as a correction, but as a realization, and for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing to add that would not reduce what had just been understood. Ava turned slightly, then placing the cloth back onto her cart, aligning it again with the same care as before, her movements quiet, grounded, consistent, as if the room had not shifted around her at all. But as she reached for the handle to move on, her eyes passed once more over the panel, not searching, not analyzing, just noticing, and that small glance carried more weight now than any demonstration, because it showed something they had all missed before: attention, not as a reaction, but as a habit. Richard followed that glance instinctively, his own perspective adjusting again, not just in this moment, but in the way he would see everything that came after. And as Ava began to move the cart toward the door, the room did not stop her. No one did, because they were still standing inside the realization she had left behind, and none of them had yet figured out what to do with it. The wheels of the cart rolled softly across the floor as Ava moved toward the door, and for a second it seemed like the moment would end there quietly, without acknowledgement, without closure, just another invisible exit, the same way she had entered. But something in the room resisted that ending. Something in the way Richard stood still, watching her leave, not with curiosity anymore, but with intention. Wait, he said, and the word was not loud, but it carried enough weight to stop everything again. Ava paused, her hand still resting on the cart handle. She did not turn immediately, she did not rush, she simply stopped, as if she had expected that possibility all along. Then slowly, she looked back over her shoulder, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, present. Richard took a step forward, not toward the safe, not toward the panel, but toward her, closing the distance, not as a command, but as a choice. You are walking out like none of this matters, he said, and there was something in his voice now, something closer to confusion than control. Ava met his gaze fully this time, not avoiding it, not challenging it, just holding it. It matters to you, she said simply. You built it. That answer landed with a quiet precision, because it did not dismiss the moment, it placed it where it belonged, and for a second Richard did not respond, because he understood what she meant: the weight of the system, the responsibility for its flaws, the realization that what had just been revealed was his to carry, not hers. One of the executives stepped forward as if to intervene, to reframe the situation, but stopped when Richard raised his hand slightly, not to silence him, but to hold the space. It matters beyond me, Richard said, and his tone shifted again, not defensive, not commanding, just honest. You changed something in this room today. Ava shook her head lightly. No, she replied. I just showed what was already there. The distinction mattered, and it settled into the room deeper than anything else, because it removed the idea of disruption and replaced it with exposure. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, then looked around the room at the people who had once filled it with certainty, now standing quieter, more measured, more aware of their own assumptions. "We missed it," he said, and this time it was not directed at Ava, it was directed at all of them, and no one argued, no one corrected him, because they all knew it was true. Ava shifted her weight, slightly, her hand tightening just enough on the cart handle to signal. She was ready to leave again. "You will not miss it next time," she said, and there was no pride in it, no expectation of recognition, just a statement of possibility. Richard stepped closer, now stopping just short of her space, his voice lower, more deliberate. "You should not be the one pointing these things out from the corner of a room," he said. Ava's expression did not change, but there was a brief pause before she answered. "I was not in the corner," she said quietly. "You just did not see me." That line settled deeper than anything else because it extended beyond the system, beyond the safe, beyond the moment itself. It spoke to something larger, something that could not be fixed with code or structure, and for a second Richard looked at her differently, not as a problem solver, not as an outsider, but as someone who had always been there, just unnoticed. He nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, then stepped back, giving her space, not out of dismissal, but out of respect. Ava turned again, this time fully guiding the cart toward the door, her steps steady, the same as before, the handle creaking softly as it moved, and as she reached the threshold, she paused just for a moment, not turning, not speaking, just standing there as if marking the end of something that had shifted more than anyone in the room had expected. Then she continued forward, the door opening quietly, the light from the hallway spilling in for a brief second before closing behind her, leaving the room as it had been, but not the same. And for a long moment no one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because they were still trying to understand what had just changed and what it meant for everything that would come next. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the sound lingered longer than it should have, as if the room itself was holding onto it, refusing to return to what it had been before. Richard did not move right away, his eyes still fixed on the place where she had stood, the reflection of the glass now empty, where she had been only moments ago. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, not uncertainty, not doubt, but awareness, the kind that does not fade when the moment passes. One of the executives cleared his throat quietly, as if asking permission to speak, without interrupting something that had not fully settled. "Sir, we should begin immediate review of all access systems across the building and prioritize recalibration of the biometric thresholds," he said carefully, his tone measured, respectful, but different now, less certain of direction, more dependent on it. Richard did not answer him immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the glass wall, where Ava had been working, his reflection replacing hers now, but it did not look the same. It felt incomplete, as if something was missing, not in the surface, but in the perspective. He placed his hand lightly against the glass, not pressing, just resting there where her hand had been moments before, and the cool surface did not change. But he turned slightly, looking back at the room, the safe, the panel, the people, all still in place, yet somehow rearranged by what they had just witnessed. "Run the review," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before. "But do not just fix the system." The executive paused, waiting for the rest, and when it came it shifted everything again. "Fix how we look at it." Richard stepped away from the glass, moving toward the center of the room, again his posture no longer carrying the same unchallenged authority, but something more grounded, more deliberate. One of the engineers nodded quickly, already typing into his tablet, his earlier confidence replaced by focus. "We will isolate the adaptive loop, identify tolerance drift, and rebuild the validation layers with stricter thresholds," he said, but even as he spoke he glanced once toward the door, as if aware that the real change had not come from data, it had come from perspective. Another engineer spoke, more cautiously now. "We should also monitor behavioral patterns across authorized users. If repetition is influencing the system, then we need to account for it in real time." Richard listened, but did not interrupt, because for once the technical response was not the center of the moment, it was a reaction to it. He looked back toward the door again, then toward the panel, then finally at the empty space beside the wall where Ava had stood, and for a brief second he saw it clearly, not just the flaw in the system, but the flaw in the room, the blind spot created by assumption, by hierarchy, by the belief that insight came from position instead of observation. One of the executives shifted slightly, sensing the change, but unsure how to respond to it. "Sir, should we bring her back in for further evaluation?" He asked, the phrasing careful but revealing because it framed her as something to be assessed rather than someone who had already proven value. Richard's gaze moved to him slowly, and there was no sharpness in it, no correction, just clarity. She was already in the room, he said, and the simplicity of that statement made the question unnecessary. The executive nodded once, understanding more from what was not said than what was, and fell silent again. The engineers returned to their work, now more focused, more attentive, but different, as if each action carried a new awareness behind it. Richard walked back to the safe, once more placing his hand near the keypad, not to open it, not to test it, just to feel the surface again, the faint marks, the subtle patterns, the evidence of repetition that had always been there. And he saw it now not as a feature, not as a flaw, but as a reminder that systems reflect the people who use them, and the people who build them, and the people who overlook them. He withdrew his hand slowly, then turned away from the safe, not because it was resolved, but because it was no longer the center of the problem. And as the room began to move again, conversations quieter, more deliberate, actions more measured, there was a sense that something had shifted beyond the technical, beyond the immediate. Something that would not reset when the system was rebuilt, because it was no longer about the code, it was about what they chose to see and what they had failed to notice, and that understanding stayed in the room long after the door had closed behind her. The room did not return to its old rhythm, even as voices slowly resumed and screens lit up with new instructions, because something quieter had taken hold, something that did not move as fast as decisions, but lasted longer than them. Richard stood near the center of the room for a moment, watching the shift unfold, not in the systems, not in the devices, but in the people, the way they paused before speaking, the way they looked twice at things they would have ignored before, the way attention itself had changed. And that was not something he could command, it was something that had to be learned. He turned toward the door again, not because he expected her to be there, but because the space she had left behind still felt present in a way he could not explain. One of the engineers approached cautiously, tablet in hand. We are mapping the tolerance drift across all access points and building a corrective model. He said, his tone steady, but different now, grounded in observation rather than certainty. Richard nodded once, acknowledging the effort, but his gaze did not linger there. It moved past him toward the hallway beyond the glass, as if following a line that extended beyond the room. Good, he said quietly. Make sure it does not just correct the system, make sure it questions it. The engineer paused for a second, then nodded again, this time more slowly, understanding that the instruction was not purely technical. Another executive stepped closer. We can also revise access protocols, limit behavioral repetition, introduce randomized variables across all entry points, he added, and while his suggestions were solid, they sounded like responses, not solutions. Richard listened, but did not immediately respond, because the answers were no longer the point. The perspective was. He walked toward the glass wall again, stopping where Ava had stood earlier, placing his hand lightly against the surface, not to test it, not to feel it, but to remember the position, the angle, the stillness with which she had seen everything they had missed. He lowered his hand after a moment and turned back to the room. We have spent years building systems to control outcomes, he said, his voice calm, but carrying through the space without force. But we have not spent enough time understanding what we are not seeing. No one interrupted, because they knew he was not speaking about the safe anymore. He was speaking about everything. One of the executives shifted slightly, then asked carefully, what would you like us to prioritize next? And the question sounded different now, not just operational, but reflective. Richard considered it for a moment, not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer mattered more than it would have before. Awareness, he said finally. Across everything, not just security, not just systems, every process, every assumption, every place we think we are certain. The room absorbed that in silence, because it was not a directive they could execute immediately. It was a change they would have to carry forward over time, and that made it heavier, more real. Richard stepped away from the glass, then moving toward the table where the meeting had started hours earlier, the same table that now felt like it belonged to a different moment entirely. He placed his hand on the back of a chair, then stopped his movement, not sitting, not continuing, just pausing, as if measuring something that could not be quantified, and for a brief second he saw it clearly, the difference between building something and understanding it, between owning a system and truly seeing it, and that difference had been standing in the room all along, unnoticed, until now. He straightened slightly, then looked once more toward the door, not expecting anything, just acknowledging the absence and what it represented. She did not change the system. He said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "She changed what we notice." And the words did not echo, they settled into the room like something that would remain long after the meeting ended, long after the system was rebuilt, long after the moment itself faded, because what had shifted was not temporary, it was foundational. And as the team returned to their work, more focused, more deliberate, more aware, the room felt quieter, not empty, but recalibrated, as if it had learned something it could not unlearn. And somewhere beyond the glass walls, beyond the hallway, beyond the reach of the systems they were now rushing to fix, Ava Brooks continued down the corridor, her steps steady, her presence returning to what it had always been, unnoticed by most, but no longer invisible to the one person who had finally learned how to see.